everyone, and thank you for tuning in to listen to the Asia CEO event, this time with a particular focus on the logistics sectors. I'm Tom Over, I'm the JLL Capital Markets Head for Industrial and Logistics, and we have seen an incredible amount of activity over the last 6 to 8 months within the cold storage, e-commerce and logistics space across all real estate asset classes. It is my delight to be welcomed back today to speak again at my second Asia CEO Forum event, and I'm looking forward to sharing some thoughts on the cold chain logistics space. So I hope you enjoy the presentation, and please do follow up if you have any questions.
I will be talking to you this morning about the cold chain logistics, an overview of the current drivers and a reflection on the opportunities and limitations from a real estate perspective of the cold chain industry in the Philippines today. So I will cover a number of very high level design parameters around cold chain real estate. Who are the players here in the Philippines? What are the demand drivers, and then what the opportunities and limitations might be going forward. So what is cold chain and what is cold storage? Well, cold storage refers to managing a temperature controlled warehouse in order to maintain a freshness of a product which is traveling through the wider cold chain distribution channels. So not only is it the facilities themselves which are temperature controlled, but the vehicles which are used to transport either from source to the cold storage facilities are also temperature controlled. In terms of the three main types of goods which are stored within cold chain, the first two are groceries and healthcare, and then a further miscellaneous group which includes products such as tobacco and wine, for example. In terms of the actual cold storage facilities themselves, there were two main categories, including a chilled warehouse, which is in order to keep perishables fresh, and then also a frozen warehouse, which is for the storage of frozen goods. And the high level of classification for the types of temperatures that these goods are kept at range from a deep frozen state under 25 degrees Celsius up to an air conditioned unit which would range between 17 and 22. So the cold chain is, as I mentioned, a supply chain within the logistics and distribution network which focuses on keeping products fresh through that supply chain. And this is an example of a modern cold chain, using the example of moving goods and groceries from the agricultural areas and farms where they are produced into the urban centres which they are used for food retailing and also food service. So from the point at which agricultural farms are producing the raw products, these either go, one, to export and to be sold abroad, and then two, into food processing. Otherwise, they are typically stored in cold storage bulk, where they are pre-cooled and they are stored relatively close to the center of production and these agricultural areas before a long-haul transport to a smaller cold storage hub where they might be ripened closer to the end user or consumer. And then that last mile transport from the cold storage hubs into food retail or food service would be the last leg of their journey. This is a reflection of where the mature market has got in other countries, and I think there is some development needs to happen to increase the wider cold storage, both from a bulk perspective and also a hub perspective closer to the urban peripherals. So what makes a cold storage warehouse different from a standard logistics dry warehouse? So the cold storage warehousing typically requires several extra installations in comparison to a standard dry warehouse. Within a dry warehouse, you tend to deliver a very voluminous open space for which racking and staging areas are then developed within that facility. Within a cold storage warehouse, as the heat transfer efficiencies are very important to manage, the warehouse itself is usually sectioned off into a number of different rooms, and also would have around 10 to 20% of the total GFA to be the staging area to ensure that you minimize the heat transfer. Extra to that, you also have elevator loading doors with sheltered doors. Each of the individual doors between the rooms also have high-speed roller doors, so that you ensure that these doors are not opened for extended periods of time. In each of the rooms, as you can see in picture 5, you'll have evaporators installed to the sides of the walls, which will then be connected to condensers on the exterior of the building. And this would be the mechanical M&E that you would need an extra to ensure that you can cool down these facilities. The picture 8 are the condensers in this example on the roof, and then you have a compressor plant which is compressing the fluid and the vapor to ensure that you can create a cold environment and cool your goods down. Overall, these facilities are typically demanding a higher load of power and have redundancy, and they are also insulated, not least from the walls and the roof, but also they have underfloor insulation. So the overall build specification is much higher than a general dry warehousing facility. So another integral part of the cold chain is the transport element, and in a mature market there is a number of ways which the goods are transported between the bulk storage and the last mile hub storage. And the three main types, firstly, are the refrigerated trailers, which would be a container which is refrigerated and then placed onto a heavy goods lorry. The second would be a refrigerated truck, which would use the engine of the van to be the generator and power for the air conditioning and evaporator unit that they have, which would cool down the goods within the storage of the van itself. And then third, another type of refrigerated truck with a eutectic plate, which is a pre-charged and cooled down plate, which is placed inside of the truck itself. In terms of the players in the Philippines, we typically divide the types of players into 4 different types of cold storage player. The firstly is a cold storage and logistics specialist who would be experts in handling, for example, agricultural products and other products in need of temperature controlled facilities, but they would have a wider agreement across a wider supply chain network with multiple storage hubs and cold chain services attached to the agreement. Secondly would be end users and owner occupiers, so this would tend to be FMCGs and pharmaceutical companies who manage and own their own cold chain for their own use. So examples of this would be any pharmaceutical companies and supermarket chains which require a large amount of cold storage for frozen goods. And then thirdly, third-party logistics companies, they would have cold chain operations and service agreements within their wider business lines, and offer management of clients' need for cold chain distribution within, for example, a beverage 3PL contract. And lastly, you have the developers and investors of the cold chains itself. So they would be owning and buying and building out land to lease to cold chain operators, and they can also enter this space via a JV partnership agreement, contributing mainly on the real estate side rather than the operational side. So in terms of the wider demographic drivers and drivers in general of the cold chain, the main driver of the Philippine cold chain market is the demographics. As we continue to see population growth over the last 5 years, and the average income reflect that growth. And this is all leading to larger and wider domestic consumption of food, beverages, clothing, housing, and all the other needs they might need in the future. And this is all contributing to a shift of demand from the traditional wet markets into a more fresh and frozen approach where they will consume from local supermarkets. In terms of the wider food retail, we typically see the food retail market in the Philippines increase around 8 to 10% per annum. The growth has been projected to be 60 billion in 2020, which would be up 20% from last year, and that is largely attributed to the pandemic we've seen over the last 8 months. Examples include SM and Pure Gold have both seen a 15% increase, and as I mentioned earlier, we're continuing to see this shifting in consumer preferences. The Philippine food retail market increases, and there is a prevalence of national and upscale supermarket chains growing throughout the country. There is a consumer demand for fresh foods as well as frozen foods, and there is a movement steadily away from the local wet markets. In terms of the new types of retail offerings, we have seen as well new types of service offerings rather than your traditional large-scale supermarkets. You've also seen a mid-size and convenience store, which would be in competition with your local sari store, and that is an area of expansion currently in response to the shifting consumer habits. There is, over the last 6 months, seen a rapid shift to the online platforms for the access to foods, and you've seen some of the stats here. There's been a 57% growth of online revenue for Grab merchants and another 12,000 new merchants on board in Grab from March to June. We've seen the pandemic as an acceleration of e-commerce and online groceries, and such as Merry Mart, Food Panda, SM and Robinsons have also opened up availability for consumers to buy straight from these traditional retailers through online platforms, which has also created demand for the wider cold storage chain logistics. In terms of healthcare, we typically see that the Philippine pharmacy retail market has increased around just over 3% per annum over the last 5 years. Philippines currently has one of the highest medicine costs in Southeast Asia, and there is a drive for consumers to purchase cheaper generic medicine, and we continue to see this growth, population and demographics, and trend towards a wider public healthcare system and access to medicine, which will create demand for the cold chain logistics. In terms of the recent pandemic, we've also seen some calls for wider vaccine storage facilities for the COVID-19, so that will also have some demand drivers on facilities across Luzon and Visayas. In terms of supply, JLL tracks all grade A cold storage facilities over 5,000 square meters, and we've seen across the Philippines 350,000 square meters of cold storage stock and another 200,000 square meters of cold and dry storage, which is a mix of those types of facilities. In terms of the types of stock that we see, the wider Cold Chain Alliance, Global Cold Chain Alliance, track cubic meters per capita. And just to give you a frame of reference, the Philippines in 2018 had 0.03 cubic meters per capita of cold chain stock, and that compared to Vietnam of 0.1 and the US of 0.5. So in terms of the wider stock, it is still relatively underserved, and you can see from the map of the wider Manila Bay Area that there are a lot of legacy facilities within Metro Manila, and then the other facilities tend to be geographically aligned to the South Luzon Expressway and the North Atlantic Expressway leading to the T-Plex all the way to San Fernando, which are bringing agricultural products down from the north. So in terms of the opportunities for cold storage facilities in the Philippines, there is firstly a build-to-suit opportunity where real estate asset owners can do a build-to-suit facility for a cold storage operator. Secondly, sale and leaseback of more legacy facilities, or where operators have done a owner-occupier operational model, they might look to release capital for their future expansion and take a lease back. Thirdly, we might see some immediate conversion of dry warehousing into cold storage facilities where the demand may be in the immediate term. And lastly, we might see real estate developers with land bank joint venture with operators, domestic and international, for the expansion through a joint venture OpCo-PropCo type arrangement. In terms of the limitations that we see, the main limitation in cold storage is that the construction cost is very high. These are obviously very highly specialized facilities and require very high build costs. They can typically range to be expensive on a square foot basis to be higher than a office building in terms of build costs. Secondly, the logistics ranking is still lagging behind. The Philippines ranks 60th in the World Bank's Logistics Performance Index, which is behind Singapore in 7th, Thailand 32nd, and Vietnam 39th. And the rest of the Southeast Asian countries still are ahead of the Philippines currently. So this creates some structural problems for developing out a cold chain strategy plan. In terms of its technical design and construction, in terms of the existing stock, 95% of the stock in the Philippines still use ammonia for their cooling, and that does have some environmental consequences, but contractors who are involved in the development of these facilities need to be very skilled and highly trained, as these are very specialized facilities and they do require personnel who have had experience in these types of facilities before. And there is a limited speculative opportunity, just as logistics facilities are not a wide speculative development strategy. Because of the high build cost and high capex requirements for these types of facilities, we don't see too much speculative opportunity here. We do see it in more mature markets where there might be a high and immediate demand for up and built facilities, but there is no market standard yet for cold chain storage here in the Philippines. So to conclude this presentation, I just wanted to draw attention back to 4 points. Firstly, being the demographic drivers of population growth and consumer demand is all increasing the demand for food, retail, pharmaceuticals across the Philippines, and that will all have its knock-on effect to the demand of cold storage, chain logistics and storage. Secondly, there has been and there is continuing to be a consumer shift from the traditional markets to a fresh and frozen markets within the supermarkets and hypermarkets, and also the local convenience stores. This has also been accelerated by the recent pandemic, as consumers have moved online and accessed new types of offerings, including online grocery. Third would be the current undersupply of the market in terms of cubic meters per capita in comparison to other emerging countries and mature markets. And overall, we're seeing a good deal of demand for the construction of new cold storage facilities. In terms of limitation, the upfront cost and capex and speciality needed to access this market is quite high. We see the construction cost being as high, or if not higher, than office developments, and the current infrastructure is relatively limited in terms of moving the goods around. However, there have been some very good signs in the market in 2020 in relation to the cold storage, and that included two pieces of news. One was a recent investment by a Singaporean company into Glacial Mega Fridge to scale up their capacity nationwide, and also Orca recently opened their 20,000 pallet position warehouse, cold storage warehouse in Taguig City, which will be the first of the country's fully automated cold chain facility. So there's some very good signs that the market is moving towards higher technology and providing for the consumer demand in the future. Thank you very much.